viewpoints expressed on Night Fright are not necessarily those of the host, the staff, sponsors, or the affiliate stations. Tonight's program may contain graphic themes or images. Viewer discretion is advised.
Showtime! Welcome to the show. My name's Brent, Holland, and welcome one and all to Night Fright. I'm pumped tonight, folks. We've got a great guest tonight, all the way from Montreal. He's driven all the way to Montreal to join us at Chapters Indigo in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. And for our American guests, Chapters Indigo is simply our version of Barnes & Noble. It's a bookstore. Just let me read this as we start. To begin, I want to read a quote from Don's book, which is called UFOs, ETs, Aliens, and Abductions. And you're probably looking at the picture of it right now. These machines are extraterrestrial vehicles, and they are a direct threat to national security. Now, why? Because we have nothing in our arsenals of weapons to defend ourselves from them. Now, folks, when I read that, my blood ran cold. It seems that aliens can and have taken human beings wherever and whenever they want, and we are completely powerless to stop them. What's more, most abductees return and are traumatized. They bear their scars on the inside, alone and in silence, afraid of being stigmatized if they speak out. So they suffer alone in the darkness, waiting for the next time the lights glows bright and they are snatched away once again. Tonight we look straight at the evidence. Don't go anywhere. Get the coffee going, get the tea going, get a beverage of your choice going. Strap in and hang on. Here we go.
There is a time for question. There is a time for answers. There is a time to challenge. There is a time to speculate. There is a time for change. There is a time for truth. The time is now. Welcome to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy. And now your host, Brent Holland.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Daily Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now. nightfrightshow.com.
Welcome one and all. Welcome to Night Fright. I'm your host, Brent Holland. Tonight, folks, UFOs and abductions all night. Just let me read this about Don Donderi's bio. UFOs, ETs, and Alien Abductions, a scientist looks at the evidence, is a new book by Don Crosby Donderi. He drove in all the way from Montreal, by the way, folks. A retired professor of psychology and former associate dean of the Faculty of Graduate Studies and Research at none other than McGill University in Montreal, of course. Now, Don reviews and analyzes 60 years of accumulated evidence that some of what people report as UFOs are indeed extraterrestrial vehicles. That some of the extraterrestrial UFOs indeed have crews, and that some of the extraterrestrial crews catch and release humans in order to study them. He's evaluated the reliability of the evidence by referring to modern theories of memory, motivation, and thinking. He explains the scientific and government reaction to the evidence, and that's where we're going to go tonight, folks. Don, welcome to the show. I'd like you to welcome to the show for the very first time, and most definitely not the last time. Welcome.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you once again for making the trek all the way from Montreal. And by the way, folks, as an enticement for the folks that are here watching, right here live in Chapters Indigo in Kingston, Don has brought some amazing Montreal bagels. Now, I love Ontario a lot, but they know nothing about making a bagel, folks. I want to start off right away, though, and this creeped me out because this is a sighting that took place not a stone's throw from here. And that sighting took place between Montreal and Ottawa on a highway I travel a lot between the two cities. Now, I want to set this up because, folks, I've traveled that highway before, and although there are sections that are very busy, there are many sections along that highway that are simply isolated. And very often there'll be a fog rolling in and a mist, and it can get downright creepy. I was wondering if we can start off with that particular sighting that took place along the Ottawa River.
Sure, be glad to.
Could you tell the folks that story?
Yes, indeed. First of all, this is a McGill story, and that makes it even more interesting for a variety of reasons. Many years ago, this is about 1973 now, a colleague, a professor at McGill, was traveling along the old 17, which goes near the Ottawa River. He was actually traveling from further than Ottawa, from Chalk River, as a matter of fact, back to McGill after doing a summer stint at Chalk River. He and his wife were in the front of the car, their son was in the back, basically asleep. Past Ottawa, between Ottawa and Montreal, the wife noticed a light that seemed to be tracking him along the side of the road. It was the summer of the comet Kahutek, so she thought maybe, even though that seemed a bit unreasonable, she might have been seeing the comet. But the thing kept pacing the car. She pointed it out to her husband, who just kept driving, paid no attention, as men sometimes don't to their wives when they tell them something while they're driving. And so they just drove on in relative silence. As the thing got closer, it looked to her like it might have been a spherical water tower. Now, you've all seen those at night, illuminated, but she couldn't see any sticks beneath it holding it up. Eventually, it began pacing them alongside the road, flew directly over in front of their car, and out the other side. Now, she remembers seeing windows that opened as the thing was approaching the car, and she saw the bright lights shining from the windows. Her husband, I'll call Professor X, saw humanoids behind the windows. Then the thing disappeared, and they drove on. They estimate the sighting took about 10 seconds. Well, that's only the story of how the thing got, what they saw. How I found out about it is even more interesting. I have a colleague, we'll call him Bill Wilson, who's an engineer, a Montreal-based engineer, who travels widely on his engineering work. He travels, whenever he goes to Ottawa, and he's obviously interested in UFOs, he takes the trouble to look into something called the non-meteorite sighting file, which was kept for many years by the National Research Council. That file contained reports from the RCMP, from local constabularies, from private citizens, of things in the sky they couldn't explain, and their own experts, that is NRC's experts, couldn't explain. So they filed them away. The public was allowed to look. You were supposed to promise not to reveal the names of the people who'd sent these reports in. But Bill Wilson looked through the files, saw Professor X's wife's name, noticed that she said her husband was Professor X who worked at McGill. He knew I worked at McGill. He figured out that if I worked at McGill and Professor X worked at McGill, perhaps I could get together with Professor X and talk about this. What he didn't know was that Professor X and I already knew each other very well, because we basically shared administrative responsibilities at McGill that put us into close contact regularly. The long and short of this was, the next time I saw Professor X, who had never mentioned this to me before, and this was several years afterwards, I said something like, well, I've got this interesting report with your wife's name on it from NRC. Can you tell me what happened? He looked a bit embarrassed because he'd never mentioned a word of this. The next week, he invited my wife and I to dinner. He told us the story you just heard. Now, the interesting thing about this is that Professor X will never again tell this story. He wouldn't reveal that to any one of his colleagues, because scientists don't talk about these things. It's not the kind of stuff that you go talking about in the faculty club over cocktails. It's just too far out. It's outre. It's not part of your scientific world to think that there are extraterrestrial vehicles that can maneuver and pace you and then zoom off into the sky in a way that you ever seen.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent, Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Daily Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now. nightfrightshow.com.
Don, I've got many questions for you about that. But first of all, I want to tell folks who we're speaking with tonight. Folks, we are live indeed tonight from Chapters Indigo in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. And once again, for our American viewers, that's a wonderful big bookstore full of books everywhere, just like Barnes and Noble. Barnes and Noble. The book is called UFOs, ETs, and Alien Abductions. Easy way to get the book, like all our guests. www.nightfrightshow.com. Just click on tonight's guest book cover. That'll take you right to a place where you can order the book from the comfort of your own home. And just to let you know, folks, stick around because we have an audience tonight, and they're full of questions. We will be doing a Q&A in several minutes and opening up the floor to our audience, who I'm sure has many questions. Now, Don, with this story, you had mentioned right away that he will not mention it again in public. Let's talk about the ostracization that comes, it's associated with somebody who's seen a UFO or somebody that's been abducted. It's something I alluded to in the opening scene of the show tonight. And that's something that really disturbs me, is that people are suffering alone.
The reason I know anything about abductions, I knew a lot about UFOs before, was that a late friend of mine, Bud Hopkins, got in touch with me in 1998 to see if I could help with some of the work that he was doing on abductions. Bud Hopkins, who died in 2011, was one of the premier abduction researchers in the United States. I didn't know him before he contacted me, but he wanted help on a questionnaire he was developing with a colleague named Ted Davis to see if you could separate people who might have wanted to be abductees but weren't really abductees from people whose experiences were a bit ambiguous. They might or might not have had this happen to them and they weren't sure. Was there any way we could do kind of psychological paper and pencil test, or computer test these days, that would put people, make it clearer whether they were on the yes it happened to me side or the no it didn't, I just thought it might have side. So I worked out a test, they worked out a test and I helped them test it. And that work has just been published in a journal called the Journal of Scientific Exploration, March 2013. Took a long time, that's 15 years of work. Bud had abductees. I met some of those abductees because I went down and visited him while doing this work. And he introduced me to people who, because he had a group of what he called a support group, were no longer alone. They could discuss their experiences with each other. And these were people who, as far as I can tell, had genuine abduction experiences. They had been picked up following what you call a close encounter, where a UFO is sighted at close range. Then they had what's called missing time, where for an hour or two they couldn't account for where they'd been. They perhaps came back to consciousness driving along the road, maybe 2 hours worth of driving from where they started. Or they seemed to remember some light shining through their window at 2 a.m. in the morning. They got back into bed at 5 a.m. and didn't know what had happened since. All of those experiences are relatively consistent. They are precursors to a valid abduction experience. Not in every case, but in most cases. These people got together with Bud because he was one of the first people to study them, and they had a support group, which everybody who's gone through psychological trauma needs, and they certainly had. David Jacobs, another colleague, was another UFO abduction researcher, and he does the same thing.
Now, what were the criteria for the study? I'm very curious. How did you rule out perhaps personal trauma, child abuse, for example, or even physical trauma?
It's hard to do.
What we did, how did you discern between the two?
It's very difficult. And I'm not sure we have completely, because this is a work in progress. Ted and Bud in the 1980s, in fact leading up to 1998, had developed a test which has 608 questions in it. That's a lot of questions, true-false questions. It's just like something called the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which is a very elaborate psychological test used by every clinician to sort out what's wrong with you, basically. You come in for a referral. Now, their idea was they could make a test that would sort out the kind of experiences you've had, whether it had to do with fearing insects, or being afraid of blood, or having a fear of the dark, or certain places in your house, or other things that might be consistent with having had an abduction experience. And they they sorted these into categories and scales, and set up a test that, if you scored high on various scales, would indicate that you'd had the abduction experience. How could they test it? They didn't know, so that's why they called me. I got two kinds of people to help with this. I got McGill undergraduates who were controls, so-called. That's a technical word in psychology, meaning people who haven't done whatever you think they've done that should make them score high on the test. These were people who we had no reason to think had any abduction experience. We got some of the undergraduates to get their parents, so we had an older sample. Again, the same thing. People who we didn't think had any reason for us to think they were abducted. Then we got another group. We call them simulators. We got people we primed to think about abductions. We asked them specific questions about the abduction experience to get them thinking about it. Then we told them, now what we want you to do is take this test as if you'd been an abductee. In other words, try and beat the test. Make us think you were an abductee. So we had three groups. The people Bud and Ted thought were real abductees, the controls we had no reason to think were abductees, and the so-called simulators, people we primed to act as abductees. We gave the test to these three groups to make a long and complicated statistical story short. These three groups were completely separate on our test. The simulators overdid it. They scored too high. The controls scored low on these scales. The abductees scored right in between. So we have a way of sorting out simulators, that is, people who are consciously trying to beat the test, from abductees, from controls. We don't have a perfect way to sort out those people from otherwise traumatized people.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent, Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Daily Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now. nightfrightshow.com.
I want to interject a story here, but first of all, I want to tell folks who we're speaking with. By the way, folks, the book is called UFOs, ETs, and Alien Abductions. Donderi, PhD from McGill, is our guest tonight. And we're talking about abductions, of course, and UFOs. www.nightfrightshow.com. Just click on tonight's guest book cover. That'll take you right to a spot where you can order the book from the comfort of your own home. Or if you're in the audience tonight, Don will be signing books very shortly. And he's got a bunch of books here with him. Now, the story I want to reiterate and tell you that I had mentioned to many people before on the show. I had a fellow by the name of Stan, oh, geez, I forget his last name, an alien abductee on the show. And he was telling me his story about the abduction experience. And we got to the point where I said, can you describe the alien who took you? And he said, sure. He said, but it was different when I was a child than when I was older. Stan Romanek, sorry folks, I blanked there for a second. He said, what happened was the alien spacecraft came down, the door opened up, and an alien walked out. And I said, well, what did it look like? He said, well, I was around 6 or 8. He said, and it looked like a fireman. Now, why I mentioned this, a few weeks before that, the fellow that used to have his radio show before mine came to me, and he's from Trinidad. And I'm going to keep his name private because he asked me to keep his story anonymous, and we're going to come back to this ostracization thing again. He said, when I was 8 years old, he said, my brother and I were playing outside of our house in Trinidad. My father was going to come out in a few minutes and call us in for supper. He said, all of a sudden, an alien spacecraft came down. The lights, this was in the middle of the day, the door opened, and out walked a fireman. And when he said that, yeah, I got goosebumps. Now, what I am curious, and I want to ask you because you're a trained professional, would that be a coping mechanism for somebody who's gone through a traumatic experience, such as perhaps child abuse?
You're a better psychologist than I am. It could be. I don't know. I'd have to look at the case. By the way, just to make sure your audience knows this, I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm a researcher.
Okay.
But that's okay. I'll do my best. That might be the best that person and the two people you're talking about came up with as a description of what these characters were wearing. They might have been wearing some kind of apparatus or or spacesuit that might have looked like a fireman's spacesuit.
That makes perfect sense.
It might have been a so-called screen memory to protect against something else, including the whole abduction experience, to make it more familiar. But honestly, I don't know. It's an interesting prospect.
I don't know. When he told me that, I got goosebumps because there's two identical, completely separate folks they'd never met before, and just unbelievable.
The other thing is, a lot of the skeptics will say all of these experiences are simply concealed child abuse or something like that. I don't think that's true, because the stories are consistent. They come with other other touchstones, so-called, that don't come out of child abuse or trauma. That is the close encounter, the missing time, and I think most of the stories I've heard, most of the accounts I've heard, are genuine, and much of the testing that's been done with abductees discovers that they're normal, that they aren't really crazy, or not even seriously psychologically disturbed. Some are, many aren't.
I would like to talk about hypnotism as well, because a big part of the book, folks, and the book is called UFOs, ETs, and Alien Abductions, and our guest tonight's Donderi, a PhD from McGill, drove all the way from Montreal to Kingston, Ontario for us tonight. Hypnotism. Now, in the book, you bring up something I hadn't considered before, and kudos to you. Very often when a hypnotist is trying to bring forth a hidden memory from their client, if you will, sometimes they instill that story inside them. So then you're left with this question mark. Is this a fabricated story instilled by the hypnotist, or is this an actual event that this person has repressed all these years? Can we talk a little bit about that? Because that's a quagmire when you're doing a study.
You bet it's a quagmire. And that's what makes it tough to use hypnosis as a tool for what you might call retrieving repressed memories. Because everyone who knows anything about hypnosis knows that you can do a couple of things with it. First, in the case of people who've gone through genuine trauma, it is possible to hypnotize them, relax them, bring them back to the time in which the trauma happened, and get them to retrieve consciously memories of what that trauma was. That can sometimes be used in the therapeutic process to let the patient re-experience the trauma. It's no longer hidden. It's no longer motivating them without knowing what's motivating them, because now they know. And that can lead to therapeutic improvement. On the other hand, it is equally possible for hypnotists to sit with somebody in front of them, hypnotize them, tell them, you have been abducted. You are now experiencing alien abduction. The aliens are green with 3 eyes, and they have symbols that look like this. Now, when you come out of hypnosis, you will remember that alien abduction, and you will tell me about it. And when they come out, they say, I've been abducted, I saw aliens with 3 eyes, they were green, and they had these little squills on the wall. That's all fake. So you have to know whether your hypnotist is reliable, what the other indicators are. But you can't use a hypnotic story by itself as evidence of an abduction. And it is a very dangerous tool.
I'm very curious about hypnotism because I can see it as a tool that can be abused as well.
Absolutely.
Especially given someone that may be a hypnotist with their own idea of what the person is suffering. I think that's the danger. Instead of it's like when you do research on anything, instead of letting the research define your thesis, they've come in with a thesis already. And I can see that as being very, very troublesome. As an extension of that, have you ever been hypnotized or been in a scenario where there was somebody being hypnotized?
I've watched hypnosis.
Could you tell us that experience?
Well, I have an experience I described in the book. First of all, when I was a boy, when I was in fact a Boy Scout, I was in a room with a bunch of other Boy Scouts who a very capable scout leader, older than I was.
By the way, folks, I was a Boy Scout too.
Okay. Well, there are 2 of us, okay. The Boy Scout leader at the scout camp I was working at that summer, as a matter of fact, hypnotized some people in the room and told them they were chickens. Would they please move around like chickens? Bark, bark, and they did. So I've seen that. More to the point, I, as I said, was a friend and colleague of Bud Hopkins, one of the premier abduction researchers who died in 2011. I was at his house one day. He sat me down at the end of a sofa. He was at the other end. A woman who's named in the book called Witness, Linda Cortilli, came in, and we went through a hypnosis session with her. I was sitting at the foot end of the couch. Bud was sitting at the head end. He'd learned hypnosis. He was practicing it. He was inducing hypnosis in Linda Cortilli, the abductee. Because when you induce hypnosis, you're saying things like, now you're very restful, you're getting tired, your muscles are all relaxed. I had driven down from Montreal, my muscles were getting relaxed. I was about to do this. I was beginning to fall asleep. And Bud said to Linda at this point, now you're in your bedroom. What do you see behind the curtains? And then she screamed very loudly, and it woke me up immediately. She then described what she'd seen, and it was aliens coming through the curtains. This was not the main event, this was a subsequent event in her book. So I was a witness to, and woke up because, or came out of my doze because a witness was emotionally upset to a very high degree at the point where he suggested not what she should see, but at that stage, what happened next. So I have seen that kind of hypnosis. That's not proof of anything. And the consistency of a story like Linda Cortilli's comes out of all the other evidence, including eyewitnesses, which are all described first in Bud's book called Witnessed, published in 1996, and then very briefly summarized in my book.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent, Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Daily Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now, nightfrightshow.com.
By the way, folks, all those stories we're talking about tonight are indeed in Don's book. It's called UFOs, ETs, and Alien Abductions, www.nightfrightshow.com. Just click on tonight's guest book cover, and you can order the book from the comfort of your own home. Don, let's keep going with that, because are there charlatans out there?
There are charlatans everywhere, every line of work. There are certainly, there's no discipline in the UFO field. There are no standards. There's no academic screening committee. Nobody says who can and who can't say they've got experiences with abductees, or that they have or don't have the qualifications to help. So if you simply go onto the internet and start looking for UFO sites, you will find hundreds of them, scores of them in any case. And I know 2 or 3 reliable ones. I know of lots of other people who tell stories or suggest things that can't be proved, and that's one of the things that keeps what you might call, in quotes, respectable people away from this. They don't know when they're being cozened or whether they're being told a straight story. And those people who want to tell the story straight, which has a number of ambiguities itself, are in trouble because there are other people who just don't care. And the story, whether it's straight or not, is something they want to get out, and they want you to listen to it. So the answer is yes. Yes. There are people who aren't telling you sensible things, they're telling you nonsensical things.
As an extension of all those questions as well, I want to talk about implants, which you discuss in great detail in the book. Have you ever met or encountered anybody that claims to have had an implant or has an implant?
The woman, Linda Cortilli, was supposed to have had an implant. It was actually photographed. And in Witnessed, which is Bud Hopkins' book published in 1996, you will see an X-ray of that implant. It came out afterwards. The implant was removed by aliens on another occasion. This has also happened to other people. I have no personal experience in working with aliens, or working with abductees.
No, I understand. Yeah. No, Whitley Strieber was on the show as well, folks.
Yeah.
You can find that in the archives, www.nightfrightshow.com. And absolutely, he was an abductee with an implant as well. Now, the implants, you drew an incredible analogy to, well, just imagine, folks, we go to Mars. We land on Mars, and we find microbiologic life form. First thing we're going to do is bring it back home and study it. And I'm wondering if this is what the aliens, they land on our planet, first thing they're going to do is bring home a species, if you will, maybe the most advanced species on our planet, although that's debatable. And the first thing you're going to do is study it, right? That's what we do. We study by nature.
And as I think you're leading up to the fact that I pointed out a very reasonable analogy. We study other species on this planet.
Bingo.
We take polar bears. We fly over polar bears with helicopters. We see a polar bear, we want to study its metabolism or what it's like at this age or that age. We shoot a tranquilizing dart from above, the polar bear kills over on the ice. We either haul the polar bear away in a net, a la abduction, or we, on the ground, go down and fiddle around with its metabolism, take some tests, stick an implant under its skin so we can telemeter it. We fly off. The polar bear wakes up, scratches its head, wonders what's happened. We assume the polar bear isn't communicating verbally to itself. Nevertheless, there's a puzzling experience there. There's missing time. The polar bear's been out for an hour or 45 minutes, and that's what happened. Humans go through very similar experiences. The reason we think they're real and consistent is that they have the following consistencies. The people who report this missing time, which is what happens to the polar bear, also report a consciously remembered close encounter. They've seen the UFO up close. And then they sometimes have rashes, they sometimes have flashbacks, they sometimes have scars. They have a number of physical symptoms that can be recorded. Hopkins made a great list of these, scars, scoops, what have you, all of which appeared afterwards and seem to be consistent with the testing idea.
And the reproduction systems of human beings seems to be a focus to the aliens, big time. And again, I draw back to the analogy of the polar bears, or perhaps animals in captivity. We breed them. We'll take sperm out of, or an egg out and sperm out of two animals and breed them in a test tube virtually. So again, there's a perfect analogy of probably what's happening to us. I want to bring up the fact that there seems to be three distinct types of aliens. There's grays, reptiles, which are pretty creepy, and every time I say that word, immediately I think of Arnold Schwarzenegger in Predator. And by the way, folks, Jesse Ventura was on the show, and we talk about Predator quite a bit. That's in the archives as well, www.nightfrightshow.com. And then the other one, which is kind of a Nordic, almost albino type. And it's my thought that just as human beings can be warlike, peace-like, perhaps these alien species represent one of those things as well. Can we talk about what people have brought forward in your research about those species?
We can, but that's pushing the limit of what I know. What I know is
speculation's fine.
Exactly what you said. The classic gray, everybody knows about gray aliens because that's
big eyes.
You see, the black eyes, the staring into you, telepathic communication, being about 4.5 to 5 feet tall, a little shorter than us, very strong and very commanding. Then there are reptilian types who have reptilian features, and there are also, as you say, non-human creatures who look more like us, who are taller, more or less like people. And one thing that one of my colleagues, David Jacobs, has pointed out, and pointed out recently at a conference I was just at, is that there may be a very large-scale interbreeding program in which aliens are trying to hybridize humans, or there may be other species out there who happen to look like us just by chance.
Just by chance.
And which is true and which is not true, nobody knows. David Jacobs has done as much research on this as anybody, and he's put together a story which includes interbreeding and hybridization. And the interbreeding is a concept that comes out of more than one person's description, too.
I think what scares me the most about abductions, folks, is the fact that we have absolutely no power over it. Often you'll hear a story where a person is just frozen and taken, and although they are still conscious, they can't move a muscle. Lost time is another example. It's just terrifying to think that we have no control over abductions. And I think it's the same type of terror, if I could draw an analogy, and perhaps you might want to validate this, is what we felt after 9/11, just after 9/11, that vulnerability that we can't stop an attack, that we are absolutely vulnerable to another attack. Would it be something like that these poor people that are abducted go through every day?
I think that's a fair point. And onto that, since you basically added a political dimension to it, I'll add a political dimension.
Please.
At the end of my book, I suggest we should begin to have a conversation about this. I mean a public conversation. Right now, the conversation is limited. At the public level, that is the people who are listening to this program, the people who read about these things, the people who are interested in them, there's awareness that something's going on at what you might call the masters of the universe level, the elite culture, the people who run our large-scale media, who publish our best newspapers, our most prestigious newspapers, and who run our most prestigious television and cable channels. There isn't a level of acceptance that this is a reality, and so people tend to defend against it. And I have some psychological reasons for this. If you don't want to believe something because it's very uncomfortable, you can find good reasons not to. And most of what you call elite culture in America, in Canada, in Western Europe, and probably the rest of the world, has found ways to defend against this really quite frightening idea that we're not in control. And the biggest way to defend against it is to call the people who present this evidence kooks, or wackos, or crazy, or out of it, or they've lost their psychological balance. In other words, to shoot the messenger and ignore the message. And that's widely done. I explained why. There are good psychological theories behind it, but your grandma could have told you this too. That's what you do if you don't want to believe something that somebody tells you. Oh, he's crazy. I can't believe that. It's nonsense. He comes from some other planet himself. That's the kind of thing you have to say. And that's what happened.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent, Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Daily Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now. nightfrightshow.com.
Absolutely. And folks, I want to just let you know, we're going to open up the floor to the audience in just a second. We're going to allow you guys to ask some questions to Don. But was there anything that shocked you in the research you did that you weren't expecting? It's kind of like that story that shocked me. I told you before about the fireman. I got goosebumps when he told me that.
I think the most compelling thing that's happened in my experience is having met, probably a dozen people who are what you might call serious abductees. Not people who just think they were, but people who you can go off a checklist and check off that they had a close encounter, that they've had multiple experiences, their families have had these experiences, their stories are consistent. There is a history of abductions of more than once for the same person, more than one person in the same family, extending over generations, consistent and believable. And that, I think, is the most shocking thing.
It is shocking, yeah, when there's no conventional reason for people to have this experience. It's outside the box, and it has to default to something extraterrestrial. Folks, our guest tonight is Don Donderi, PhD from McGill. He's written an incredible book, one I've gone through several times, UFOs, ETs, and Alien Abductions. A scientist looks at the evidence. A big difference there is when a scientist looks at the evidence. It gives credibility and validation. It's a terrific book, well written, lots of information about the Cold War, lots of information how we got from A to Z, or Z, for our Canadian guests as well. I'm going to open up the floor, folks. www.nightfrightshow.com, by the way. Just click on tonight's guest book cover, and that'll take you right to a spot where you can order the book. I'm going to open up the floor. Has anybody got any questions for our guest tonight, Don? Sure, fire away. Could you just say your first name?
I'm Bobby.
Hi, Bobby.
Hi. I just wondered, what about doing lie detector tests? Is that something that you can fool or something like that?
It's been done in one or two cases where there was a great publicity about a particular case. In Pascagoula, Mississippi in the 70s, two men claimed to have seen a craft at close range in the swamps. They were out fishing. They came back. They were basically frightened. They told the cops. The cops had them in a room where they were talking to each other. Unbeknownst to them, they were being recorded, and they basically simply didn't say we're fooling the cops. They were frightened to death, and they were going over what had happened to them and how can we deal with this. Later on, the publicity on this story got out. People interviewed them. They were challenged to take a lie detector test. They did, and they passed. So it's been done, not every time. And it's a tricky business, and it's a relatively expensive business, and it also takes experts to interpret. So it hasn't been done every time.
I can understand that. That's a very good question, by the way. Anybody else have a question?
My name's Rick. Don, was it?
Yes.
A friend of mine had an experience with the Men in Black phenomenon when he was about 12 years old.
Please.
And basically he came into the house and he had looked down the hallway and he saw the classic figure, 7 foot in silhouette, wearing a fedora, and he could see the face, and it had a face of like almost a cocky-looking face, and a grimace of evil. He was speaking. He wasn't alone in the house. His parents had gone the other way into the living room. Anyway, he ran the other way, and when he looked back a few seconds later, it was gone. Just like that. Now, what I'm wondering about is that a Men in Black, does that fit into one of the 3 categories of aliens you described? Perhaps
a good question, too. It's a good question. It fits into a category of what seems to happen afterwards. And Men in Black has become a joke, as you know, because there's a whole series of movies about America's Men in Black who are trying to balance, trying to deal with the aliens who are all around us all the time, and it's great fun. But seriously, the Men in Black they allegedly show up after there's been an alien encounter. They intimidate people into not talking about it. Whether this is real, or who's responsible, and how it happens, I don't know. I don't deal with it in the book because I don't know much about it. That's the unfortunate truth. There's a lot more to know. If you want a thorough course on UFOs, you better ask other scholars than myself, because I only know part of the story. And that's usually the way it is in the developing science, too.
Let me throw this out to the audience. Folks, any of you ever seen a UFO or had a sighting yourselves? No, me either. And I was just curious about that.
I have. I can put my hand up.
Okay, please.
It's the kind of thing that many people would have seen and not paid much attention to. And I don't either because it's such a small sighting. But one of the categories, in fact, the least interesting category of UFO sighting is called a nocturnal light. And there's a classic pattern in which a light appears in the sky. Now, as you all know, satellites go over very smoothly like that. They're very bright, they're very visible, they move slowly through the sky, and that's either the space station or somebody's satellite, and everybody by now for the last 50 years has seen one of those.
Whenever I see that, Don, I just want to interject. I always wave because I always think it's the NSA or somebody looking at me. So.
Just get on your cell phone, they'll be listening.
Yeah, and I run and put my pants on right away, folks.
The other kind of nocturnal light bounces across the sky like this. It doesn't go like an airplane. It doesn't go like a helicopter. It doesn't go like a Piper Cub. It's distant, and it has a kind of falling leaf motion, or like flying saucer skipping through the water. I've seen one of those. My wife has seen one of those. Many people have. But if that's all we saw, and if that was the entire phenomenon, we'd still be just scratching our heads about it. It's so distant and so unobtrusive that you really wouldn't notice.
One thing that you cleared up that I was always perplexed about, I always thought if aliens had the technology to visit us from so far away, why the hell would they come and be so reliant on lights? I mean, it's not an airplane, so it doesn't have to light up for safety reason. But then you explained it in the book, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, UFOs glow in the dark, basically. And that's understandable because what's happening is that whatever propulsion system the UFO uses, and this is not my idea, this is borrowed from a late aeronautical engineer named Paul Hill, whatever propulsion system enables them to control gravity, which apparently is how they do it, produces a lot of shortwave radiation, like gamma rays, microwave, stuff you use to cook your food. That heats the air and makes the air glow. So the UFO appears to be surrounded by a little glowing nimbus at night, or in the daytime. This air will be a little, what you might call, slightly blurry.
Distorted.
Distorted. And so those are things that people commonly observe, and those are the explanations for it. The glow is ionized air, which is a byproduct of the propulsion system.
And you know, that answered it perfectly for me, folks. All these years I've been trying to figure out why indeed they would come and people are seeing lights in the night sky when I always thought they could be stealthy and just show up just like that. And definitely that makes perfect sense to me. I want to go back to the audience. Anthony Mann is with us tonight, folks. He's a well-known Canadian, he's a bit of a Canadian legend as a filmmaker. He's done all kinds of great things. Dracula. He's working on a movie right now called Phantom of the Opera. He's an ex-Montrealer, as Don and I are, and Anthony is also a personal friend of mine. Anthony Mann.
It's a pleasure to be here on a great program, and Don, thanks for coming to Kingston to chat with us. So now I've been a believer in aliens and also the paranormal all my life. One of the arguments that I've always heard is, well, no, there can't be other life in the universe, and I think that as I was chatting with this gentleman over here earlier today, with Rick. You know, as each and every year, we're starting to realize how large how large the universe is, and how infinitely unimportant we are in the grand scheme of things. So I think there is a certain audacity, or I would dare say, venture even in ignorance. You know, with regards to the belief that, you know, there cannot be other intelligent life out there. I think it's actually so ludicrous consideration. Now, one of the cases that I've often been fascinated with is the Mothman phenomenon from the 1960s and 70s. I don't know if you've read John Keel's book, but
The Mothman.
Of Mothman, yeah, which has been chalked, of course, to a series of visitations by people from either a different dimension or from a different world. Do you have any insight? Have you done any research or
good question,
or exploration of the Mothman phenomenon?
The embarrassing thing to say when you're an academic and you haven't done any of this is no. I have to be very direct. I've read about it. I've read about it at second hand. I haven't followed it up clearly. There are many types of apparitions that people have seen over the last couple of hundred years that have been well documented. All might be related to extraterrestrials, but in this particular one I read about, there's a guy called Spring Hill Jack who used to Spring Hill Jack, who lived in England and was seen bouncing around London and getting away quickly by making big leaps from here to there. All of those are possible candidates, but none of them have been as thoroughly researched as the, what you might call, classic, mundane, everyday UFO phenomenon, which we're now talking about. And I wish I could say more, but unless I was basically just BSing, I couldn't. I just don't know.
And that's fair enough, and I think it's the unknown, actually, which both terrifies and also creates an allure for people to explore paranormal phenomena.
I agree.
What are your sentiments in regards to paranormal, ghostly, spiritual apparitions, the existence of life beyond this particular life, as a scientist?
As a scientist, I have published a paper on extrasensory perception, which is very rare in my trade, put it that way. One of my graduate students who was going on to medicine and had nothing to lose did a paper with me on telepathy. We published it in the psychology in Journal of Psychology in 1977, I think.
What were the results, Don?
Oh, we demonstrated a telepathic communication of information from people on one side of the building to people on the other side of the building.
Wow.
In, as I said, 1977. That's not the only telepathy example. There are telepathy examples in my book. The aliens communicate with us telepathically, clearly. So that can be done. Nobody knows how we do it, but it can be done. And that, again, that's evidence. I don't have a theory. I just have the data.
Interesting. Very, very interesting stuff. Folks, we're speaking with Don Donderi tonight. We're talking about UFOs and alien abductions. His book is called UFOs, ETs, and Alien Abductions. A scientist, which he indeed is, looks at the evidence, and Don has joined us all the way. He's driven all the way from Montreal to Kingston, Ontario, Canada, to join us here live for a show. First time we're doing this in Chapters Indigo, and again, for our American guests, that's Barnes & Noble, huge bookstore. And we have a wonderful, a lot of audience folk with us tonight, and they've asked some outstanding questions. Don, we're going to have to start to wrap up this portion of the show right now, but certainly we're going to do a second show, folks, right after, so stick around for that. But I want to ask you, are there any criteria in the research you've done that you feel you would like to go back and do differently?
Well, there are things I haven't done that need to be done. For example, one of the audience asked a question about separating various kinds of traumatic experiences from the alien abduction experience by tests. We've managed to separate the alien abduction experience from fakers, people who are deliberately trying to say they were, but we haven't got a sensitive test that separates a person who might, for some psychological reason, think he or she's been abducted from someone who really has. That's an excellent question. Work remains to be done. When you get started on trying to really nail things down, turns out there always is lots more to do. And now we'll get to another one later, but alien symbols is another one. It's a big topic.
Now, we had mentioned governments and how they don't like to mess with this type of stuff. How were you able to get funding for this study?
Oh, I never had any funding.
Oh, interesting.
The funding, actually, that's not literally true. Orange County Mutual UFO Network funded Bud Hopkins to do some of the work on abductions. Bud sent me some of that money so I could hire undergraduates to do some of this research.
Oh,
so yes,
private
I was funded,
funding.
but privately, from the Mutual UFO Network. God bless them.
Yeah, MUFON, of which local Kingston resident Dan Aykroyd is a member, by the way, folks.
Yes, he is. He's most interesting.
He sure is. He's a terrific guy. Folks, you've been watching Night Fright. Our guest tonight was Donderi. UFOs, ET, and alien abductions, www.nightfrightshow.com. Just click on tonight's guest book cover, as always. I'm Brent Holland from Night Fright. Don, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
See you next time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brent. That was fun.
That was fun.
You're listening to Night Fright and your host, Brent Holland. The time is now. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Daily Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now, nightfrightshow.com.